I'm Chad Emmett, a professor of geography at BYU. We welcome our four presenters today. Our first presenter is Sherilyn Farnes from the LDS Church History Department. She received her bachelor's and master's degree in history from Brigham Young University. Her research has focused primarily on early church history and more specifically on the family of Edward and Lydia Partridge. She has published and presented on various members of that family and is helping to prepare the papers of Edward's Partridge for publication. She has taught Doctrine and Covenants at BYU and freshman writing at BYU and community colleges in Salt Lake City and Washington, D.C. After serving a mission in the country of Latvia, she has enjoyed returning to visit friends and volunteer in an orphanage in a small village in eastern Latvia. She currently works as a historian at the Church History Library, and when not working there, she loves spending time with her family. We'll turn the time over to Sherilyn now.
Good morning. It's good to be here. Several years ago, there was a 3-year-old girl who found out that her great uncle worked in the temple. And with wide eyes, she looked at him and she said, "Do you know Zacharias?" And as I thought about that little story, I thought, that's kind of how people feel about Latvia sometimes. She had a little bit of a problem with chronology, but a lot of us have misperceptions about Latvia. And so hopefully as we go through this, we can clear up some misperceptions about Latvia. As one Latvian quipped during the Olympics, he says, we may not win a lot of medals, but when we do, we make the world learn geography. So here's a map, and it shows where Latvia is. It's located in northeastern Europe. Latvia is a beautiful country that has long summer days. The days can last up to about 18 hours of sunlight. Of course, the flip side is, when it comes to be winter, there are cold winter nights that can last about 17 hours. But the snowfalls can make it exquisite, make it look like a winter wonderland. I don't think I've been anywhere so beautiful. Latvians as a people have existed for a long time. Riga was founded in 1201, and about 80 years later, is the first mention of their flag that they currently use, which is a red stripe, a white stripe, and then a red stripe. Latvia consists of mostly Latvians, also a lot of ethnic Russians, as well as other minorities. The country itself is predominantly Lutheran Catholic and Russian Orthodox. We're going to start with the first missionary, which was in 1903, Misha Markov. He arrived in Latvia which was then a part of Russia, I should mention, shortly after it had been dedicated by Apostle Francis Lyman for the preaching of the gospel. That was in August, and Misha Markov arrived in October. But to give you a little bit of background on him, he was a barber. He'd been born in Hungary, and he joined the church in 1887, was baptized in the Black Sea, and though encouraged to emigrate to Zion, he decided he wanted to be a missionary first. So he traveled all around Eastern Europe, largely on his own, and he actually returned on more than one mission after he came to the States. Then he returned back. And so I'll share with you his experience when he got to the city of Riga. He was informed that foreigners had to register within 48 hours, so he wanted to obey the law. But he was a little concerned, and I'm going to read you in his own words because you can kind of hear his accent and I think get a feel for who he is. He says about registering, "I did not want to go myself because they will ask me many questions, but I send the lady with my passport to register my name, the lady where I did lodge. She went to the court, but they did not want to register my name. They want me, I shall come myself. So I went. Then they asked me what I am doing in the city. I told them that I was a preacher, and they asked me to which church I belong. I told them the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he said to me, 'That is a very long name. I don't have so much space in the book.' And then he said to me, 'Don't that church has another name?' I said, 'Yes, the Church of Jesus Christ.' Then he put Church of Christ, and then he registered my name as a missionary of Church of Christ, but they did not know that I was a Mormon." And before I go any further, I want to pull up a picture of him. I thought, it's a long time ago, maybe we don't have any pictures of him, but hopefully. So I searched around, and I found one in the Ensign. So here's a picture of Misha Markov. And like you, I also laughed. I thought, well, that's pretty funny. And then I found a real photo of him in the Deseret News, and I realized it was actually amazingly accurate. So that is Misha Markov. Phenomenal. I encourage you to go read about him if you've never heard of him. He's a fascinating individual. So he starts preaching. He gets registered. He starts preaching. He speaks several languages. Interestingly, even though it's part of Russia, and there were Latvians living there, he didn't speak, as I understand, either of those, but he did speak German, and there were a lot of Germans, because Germany had also controlled Latvia, along with several other countries. And so he starts preaching to the Germans. Unfortunately, he gets in trouble with the law, not because he's done anything that we would consider illegal, but because of his missionary activity. And they tell him that he needs to leave. Following the counsel of his mission president, Francis Lyman, he opts to leave rather than to be exiled to Siberia. As he understood it, he, as I believe he later learned, preaching against the Russian Orthodox Church could lead to exile for 2 years in Siberia, and baptizing a member of the Russian Orthodox Church could lead to exile for 12 years in Siberia. So President Lyman had said, if you're going to be exiled, it's better to just leave. You can always go back later. So he leaves, and interestingly, about 15 years later, Latvia becomes its own country in 1918. They were independent and free for about 22 years, and then in 1940, they're annexed by the USSR. And so Latvia has no official church presence for about 90 years. And generally, when we read histories of the church in a country, we see that, and there's no official church presence, we kind of skip over. But there's a few things that I wanted to mention that are going on at this time. First of all, the USSR is making all the Latvians learn and speak Russian. And so on the left you have some Latvian, and on the right you have some Russian. And secondly, as Latvia is experiencing these Second World War and other things going on, many Latvians choose to leave. They choose to flee to Germany or Australia or the United States or Canada. And thirdly, and I should mention one young man who fled was named Boris Shields. He was 15 years old, he was a teenager, and he left with his family in 1939. He will come into play a little bit later, as will the language issue. Thirdly, although religious worship was discouraged or even prohibited, there was what I would call a resistance group, and it was composed of grandmothers. These grandmothers didn't necessarily meet together, they weren't organized, and so forth. But over and over again, as I have spoken with people in Latvia about their feelings about religion, they would often say, not everyone, but often they would say, you know, my parents weren't really religious. We couldn't go to church when I was growing up, so they didn't go to church. We weren't religious, they're not religious, but my grandmother taught me to pray. And so I think that in a history of the Church of Latvia, I want to pay tribute to these Latvian grandmothers, most of whom never heard about the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, but I think are an essential part of the history of the church in Latvia. So we have these grandmothers, and then in 1991, Latvia regained its independence, and missionaries began to enter the country. But first, before they entered the country, we have the Sankani family. And I don't know if their daughter is here, potentially. She is here today. Guido, the father, and Velga, the mother, were studying in Moscow. And Guido first met the missionaries in May of 1991. He was confused at first why the missionaries seemed so happy. He said they couldn't drink, they couldn't smoke, they couldn't go on dates with girls. It's like, there's some secret reason that they are so happy. But he started meeting with them when his wife Velga and their oldest daughter Judite, pictured here, when they returned from summer vacation. And so in the fall of 1991, Velga explained later that while her husband Guido wanted to be baptized, she said, I had a lot of questions, but I had a really good feeling while meeting with the missionaries. On January 5th, 1992, Guido, the father, was baptized. Shortly thereafter, he received the Aaronic priesthood, and shortly thereafter, he baptized his wife on February 1st, 1992. And then that summer, they returned to Latvia. And interestingly, so they're part of obviously a Russian mission. Missionaries had just barely gone into Russia, but missionaries were not allowed yet into Latvia. And so the missionaries told the Sankani, they said, you know, just go home, pray, do your best, and maybe missionaries will come. Maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, we don't know, but go home and do your best. So the Sankani family returns home. They're in Riga. Velga is at home one day and she gets a call. Now remember, so they're outside mission boundaries. She gets a call from one of the missionaries that taught them. And the Sankani live just outside the capital city of Riga. And the missionary said, I forget, is it Sister Sankani or Velga? We're in Riga. And she says, I kind of paused and said, does your mission president know? Fortunately, he did. He had sent them there. And this is June 17th, 1992. And the first 4 missionaries were being sent to Latvia to open the country. Slightly prior to that, we have a couple named Boris and Liselada Shiel. And let me show you a picture of them. This is the brother Shiel that left as a teenager from Latvia, so he speaks Latvian. He also speaks German, English, and Russian. He and his wife were called on a mission to go back to Latvia to help open the country. And so they traveled there. They got to go on a visit and took a little vacation. Before their mission started, they met up with some of the church leaders who'd flown in to arrange the opening of the church in Latvia. And they took over an apartment. They didn't took over, it sounds like they attacked it. They agreed to take the apartment to continue renting it when a couple that was there teaching English went home to the United States. So the Shields had previously arranged this apartment. They go home, the 4 missionaries arrive, and unbeknownst to them, the Shields have this apartment in Riga already. The 4 missionaries selected a meeting place, which was coincidentally across the street from the Shields apartment. And this is in a city of several 100,000 people. So we have this minor miracle taking place. I will mention also Velga Sankane, pictured in the previous slide. From the beginning, she had a desire to preserve the history of the church in Latvia. And so a lot of what you'll see here today, and a lot of what we have, is because from the beginning she sensed that she was part of something historic, and that she should be documenting, and that she should be preserving that. And so I'm very grateful to her and for the effort that she has made to preserve this history. So from the beginning, we have the challenge of language. We have, except for Brother Shiel, we have these missionaries that speak Russian. And I remember that Latvia has just been controlled by the Russians for 50 years. They're pretty upset that they had to speak Russian, that the Russians were there, and there were still Russian troops for 3 years after their freedom. And so we have missionaries trying to contact in the Russian language, which led to a lot of conflict. But fortunately, a lot of people, because the USSR had made them learn Russian, they were able to communicate with these Russian missionaries. They were able to read the Book of Mormon. They were able to read other scriptures. They were able to experience the church in Russian. And so while they were not pleased that they had been forced to give up their native language for so long, or to use Russian officially, it proved to be a blessing, a silver lining, if you will, of the establishment of the church. For example, the first time they went to the temple, it was all in Russian. Interestingly, when Apostle Lyman had dedicated the land of what was then Russia, so this is back in 1903, he had prayed, and I'm going to read you kind of what he expressed. He says, he had prayed that the hearts of the sincere and honest might be turned to seek for the truth, and petitioned the Lord to send servants full of wisdom and faith to declare the gospel to the people of that land in their own language. And so even though many Latvians understood Russian, some did not. And this is a woman affectionately called Sister Helen, Masa Helena Pine. And although about 70 years old, she had never learned Russian. And as she learned about the gospel, she realized that she wanted to join. She couldn't read the Book of Mormon. She couldn't understand Russian church meetings, but she wanted to join anyhow. And so she was baptized in the fall of '92, and her baptism was the first baptism service that is conducted entirely in Latvian. The story is told that because of her faithfulness in attending the temple, it was one of the motivators to the temple ordinances and ceremony were translated into Latvian. A year after the missionaries first arrived, Elder James E. Faust came to dedicate the land on March 17, 1993. And while he was there, he gave a prophecy. He said, and I use that word because that is what he used. He said, I prophesy, speaking to the missionaries in a meeting, I prophesy in your lifetime, you will see several stakes organized in the country of Latvia under Latvian leadership. And so the church continued to grow. As it went throughout the years, more and more cities were opened. But the very first year that the church was there, they started to translate the Book of Mormon. They did want the Book of Mormon in their own language. And so a team, including Guido Sankans, who I mentioned had joined the church in Russia, began translating. And I want to share a quick story about translation of the scriptures. And although the specific story is about the triple combination, I think it highlights the hunger, the desire to have the scriptures in their own language. It's from a mission president that was traveling on some church business with Guido Sankans, and they had gone. Guido became a branch president, district president. He's now in Area Authority 70. So this mission president related his experience. He said, in mid-May of this year, we, Guido Sankans and I, traveled together to Ukraine for training by Elder El Tamperi of the 12. We had a couple of wonderful but exhausting days in Kiev. We had about 30 minutes in the airport before boarding our plane to return to Latvia. We were both tired, and I headed for a chair in the airport boarding area to sit down. I sat down, so did President Sankans. I started to relax. He reached for his laptop computer and turned it on. I said, President, what are you doing? He said, I'm going to translate. I have a few minutes for the Lord, and I am going to use it. I thought, well, maybe this is an interesting part of the triple. Maybe the Book of Moses or Abraham or even the Joseph Smith story. No, he said, I am translating the index. Then he got on the plane. I leaned back, and he began the translation of the index once again. And I love that because it shows this dedication that Guido Sankans had in preserving in trying to get the Book of Mormon translated into Latvian. And it was translated and published in 2001. The triple combination in 2006 became available. And here's a picture of saints receiving the Book of Mormon in Latvian for the first time in their own language. This is in the coastal city of Liepāja, but I want to tell you a quick story about the capital city of Riga when they received the Book of Mormon. Again, this comes from a mission president that was just kind of sitting back like a fly on the wall watching. He said they delivered 40 copies of the Book of Mormon, just published in Latvian, to the branch president, who was Gatis Senkans. And Gatis is the brother of Guido, and Gatis had also been involved in the translation. So they delivered these 40 copies of the Book of Mormon, and President Gatis Senkans, he chose to call the head of each family who was attending church that day into his office, and without prior announcement, to present them with their first copy of the Book of Mormon in Latvian. He says he started in Sunday school, and he just called them out one by one from Sunday school into his office and just gave them a copy of the Book of Mormon in Latvian. And President Lund said, "I was not in his office when the presentation was made. I only saw the people come back to the classroom with tears in their eyes, hugging a Book of Mormon to their chest." Eventually, temple ordinances were translated into Latvian, and on the left you see a picture of the first group that attended the temple, the Latvian session. And I don't know if I have a pointer or a mouse, but right here it looks like Masa Helena. The issue of language persists. We have branches that go back and forth. Initially, they were all combined in one language, and then they split Latvian and a Russian branch, and then they're divided geographically, and they split again. And so there's still issues as they try and figure out what makes the most sense for them at any point in time. I wanted to, just before I close, acknowledge also, they had their 20-year anniversary. So in 1992, the first missionaries were there. So in 2012, not that you can't do the math, they celebrated their 20th anniversary, and they prepared an hour-long video in Latvian, English, and Russian. Sister Velga Sankanai, whom I mentioned previously, who's had an interest in preserving the history, as well as a woman named Lena Blume, who also preserves. So both of their work, as well as the histories by Boris Shields, that first missionary who spoke Latvian, a senior couple, as well as an interview that Matt Heiss of the Church History Department did. So I'm indebted to them. In closing, the Lord foretold, "For it shall come to pass in that day that every man shall hear the fullness of the gospel in his own tongue and in his own language." I don't think, at least I speak for myself, as someone who speaks a language that is fairly common around the world and is used worldwide, I don't think I can fully appreciate the significance of that, to have the gospel and the fullness of the gospel in my own language and in my own tongue. But to Latvians, it means a lot. When I lived there and I spoke to them in Latvian, they were thrilled. They said, "You're speaking my language." I remember sitting with a gentleman from Russia, or a gentleman from Latvia. His wife was from Russia, and my companion and I were from America. And he said, "Isn't this amazing? Here you are from America, you speak English. Here's my wife, she's from Russia, and yet we're all here sitting, speaking in Latvian." And it meant a lot to him that we had learned Latvian. For Latvians and an agricultural community, light is important. They understand the life-giving qualities of sunlight. And through the cold, dark winter, they wait for the spring and the summer when they have that sunlight in greater abundance. In fact, they have a holiday called Yanya and Ligua. And what they do, it's around the shortest night of the year. They celebrate by coming together, family and friends. They make crowns of leaves, place them on their heads. They build bonfires. They even jump over the bonfire, and they stay up all night, and they wait for the dawn because it's the shortest night. And so they stay through the night awake and watch for it. And every time I think about that holiday, this practice, it reminds me of the second verse of Hark All Ye Nations, which incidentally, as I drove down here this morning and put in a conference CD, that was the first song that came on, was Hark All Ye Nations. And the second verse says, "Searching in darkness, nations have wept. Watching for dawn, their vigil they've kept. All now rejoice, the long night is o'er. Truth is on earth once more." Thank you very much.